The snow fell relentlessly that night, blanketing the quiet town of Riverbend in an icy stillness. Lila Anderson didn't expect much from her late-night drive home, just the cold, the dark, and her own solitude. But as her headlights cut through the frozen wilderness, they caught something unusual. A cardboard box, abandoned on the roadside, seemed out of place against the pristine white. Her instincts kicked in. What she found inside would unravel a web of cruelty, mystery, and danger she hadn't faced in years. But who left it there, and why? Chapter 1. Shadows Beneath the Moon. The wind howled like a restless spirit, tearing through the skeletal trees of the Riverbend forest. Under the pale light of a waning moon, a lone figure moved with labored steps across the snow-laden ground. It was a golden retriever, her once radiant golden coat now matted with ice and dirt. Her breaths came in short, visible puffs, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Trailing behind her, 5 tiny puppies struggled to keep up. Their fragile bodies stumbled in the snow, their small paws sinking into the icy ground. The mother would stop every few paces, turning back to nudge one of them forward with her nose, her amber eyes filled with desperation. Every ounce of her strength was devoted to keeping them moving, keeping them alive. For hours, the mother dog had wandered through the freezing wilderness, her legs heavy and raw from the jagged, frozen terrain. She had no destination, only the primal instinct to search for shelter and safety. Her stomach ached with hunger, and the bitter wind pierced her thin frame like knives. The puppies whimpered softly, their tiny cries almost swallowed by the storm. Each sound made the mother pause, lowering her body to the ground to shield them from the worst of the wind. Snowflakes clung to her fur as she huddled over them, her heart pounding as she listened for predators, or worse, the sound of human footsteps. Her neck bore a deep, circular scar, a haunting reminder of the chain she had once worn. It had been tight, cruelly so, cutting into her skin and leaving a permanent mark. She had broken free, but the scar remained along with the pain it symbolized. The hours stretched on and the mother's strength began to falter, her vision blurred, her legs buckling beneath her weight. Finally, she stumbled onto a desolate dirt road cutting through the forest. She froze, her ears pricking at the faint hum of an engine in the distance. The sound grew louder, the headlights of an approaching vehicle piercing the darkness like twin beacons. She stood still, her legs trembling as the vehicle slowed and came to a halt. A woman stepped out, her silhouette backlit by the truck's headlights. The woman hesitated, shining a flashlight toward the trembling figure in the snow. Lila Anderson had seen many heart-wrenching sights in her years as a detective, but nothing had prepared her for this. The golden retriever stood before her, shivering violently in the freezing air, her body shielding 5 tiny, fragile puppies huddled together in the snow. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Lila, not with aggression, but with a silent, desperate plea for help. "Oh my God!" Lila whispered, stepping closer, the crunch of her boots muted by the howling wind. She knelt down, her flashlight revealing the full extent of their suffering. The puppies were barely moving, their tiny bodies stiff with cold. The mother stood protectively over them, her body frail and trembling. "It's okay, girl," Lila said softly, her voice breaking through the storm. "I'm here to help." She extended a gloved hand towards the mother, who flinched but didn't move away. Her eyes remained fixed on Lila, filled with both fear and trust, as if she understood this was her last chance. Carefully, Lila scooped up the first puppy, its body cold and limp in her hands. The mother tensed but didn't protest, watching intently as Lila carried the pup to the truck and wrapped it in a blanket. She returned for the others, moving quickly yet gently, her heart aching with every fragile bundle she carried. Finally, it was just the mother left. "Come on, girl," Lila urged, her voice calm but firm. "You can't stay out here." The dog hesitated, her legs trembling, her eyes darting toward the dark woods. For a moment, Lila thought she might refuse, but then, with great effort, the mother limped forward, climbing into the back of the truck. Lila closed the door and got behind the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror at the family now nestled in the warmth of the cabin. The mother lay curled protectively around her puppies, her eyes wide and alert. As the truck rumbled toward Lila's animal shelter, she couldn't help but notice something strange. The circular scar around the mother's neck was too precise, too deliberate. It wasn't just an accident, it was the mark of cruelty. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. Someone had hurt her, badly. And as Lila drove through the storm, she wondered who and why. The warmth of the animal shelter brought a fragile sense of calm, but the echoes of the storm still lingered in Lila's mind. The mother dog, now resting on a soft blanket, kept a vigilant watch over her 5 pups. Lila couldn't help but notice how the dog flinched at every unexpected sound, her amber eyes darting nervously toward the door. Something about her behavior nagged at Lila, a whisper of unease she couldn't ignore. As she carefully examined the mother dog's coat for injuries, her fingers brushed against something hard buried beneath the matted fur on the dog's neck. Frowning, Lila gently parted the fur, revealing a small metal tag tangled in the mess. She removed it cautiously, her heart sinking as she examined the item under the light. The tag was old and tarnished, but a faint inscription was still visible. It wasn't a name or an address as she had expected, but a cryptic sequence of numbers, 04789 GH2. Lila tilted her head, her instincts as a former detective stirring to life. It wasn't just an identification tag. It felt like a clue. "Who put this here?" she murmured, glancing at the dog, who remained silent but watchful. The tag didn't fit the image of a family pet. It felt cold, clinical, more like a tracker than something a loving owner would attach. That night, as the puppies dozed peacefully under their mother's care, Lila sat at her desk, the tag placed beside her computer. Curiosity gnawed at her. The number could mean anything or nothing. But the scar around the dog's neck and the hauntingly precise engraving on the tag told her there was more to this story. Unable to resist, she picked up her phone and dialed Ethan Clark, an old friend and one of the few people she trusted. Ethan had been a sheriff in Riverbend for over a decade, and while their paths had diverged when Lila left the force, their bond remained intact. "Ethan, it's Lila," she said when he answered. "I need a favor." The following morning, Ethan arrived at the shelter, his presence as steady and reliable as ever. His tall frame filled the doorway, and his sharp blue eyes quickly scanned the room before landing on Lila. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said, stepping inside and shaking off the cold. "What's going on?" Lila handed him the tag, explaining how she had found it hidden in the dog's fur. Ethan studied the numbers, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "This looks odd," he admitted, "not like a normal ID tag." "Can you look into it?" Lila asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "I have a bad feeling about this." Ethan nodded. "I'll run it through the system. Might take some time, though." As Ethan left with the tag, Lila returned to the mother dog and her puppies. The dog's gaze followed her every move, a mix of gratitude and unease in her eyes. Lila knelt beside her, running a soothing hand over her golden coat. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. "I promise." 2 days later, Ethan called with the results. His tone was grim. "Lila, you were right to trust your instincts," he said. "That number belongs to a shipment catalogue from an international database used to track exotic animal trades. It's tied to a low-hang-by that Lack, or rather, reported missing 6 months ago. The shipment was flagged for containing trafficked animals." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "You're saying this dog, this family, was part of an illegal trade?" "It's possible," Ethan replied, "but there's more. That shipment wasn't just abandoned. It was stolen, and the people who took it, they don't just let things go." The weight of his words settled over Lila like a heavy blanket. She glanced at the mother dog lying in the corner of the room, her eyes still watchful, despite the warmth and safety of the shelter. Lila's mind raced. If Ethan was right, then this dog and her puppies weren't just abandoned. They were survivors of something far darker. And if the people responsible were still out there, they wouldn't stop until they reclaimed what they thought was theirs. Lila knelt beside the mother dog, placing a hand gently on her head. "You've been through more than I can imagine, haven't you?" she said softly. The dog leaned into her touch, a flicker of trust in her amber eyes. But as the sun set that evening, a shadow of unease crept into Lila's heart. Whoever had hurt this dog wasn't done with her yet, and Lila had just stepped into their path. The shelter was unusually quiet that night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, casting a silvery glow across the landscape. Inside, Lila sat by the fireplace, absently flipping through a book, while the mother dog lay curled around her puppies. Though the warmth of the fire filled the room, an uneasy tension lingered in the air, gnawing at Lila's senses. Suddenly, a faint noise cut through the silence, a rustling sound, almost too soft to notice. Lila froze, her ears straining. The noise came again, this time louder, as if someone, or something, was moving just outside the door. Sandy, the mother dog, lifted her head, her amber eyes narrowing, as a low growl rumbled in her throat. Lila's heart quickened. She set the book aside and moved to the door, grabbing a flashlight on her way. "Stay here," she whispered to Sandy, though the dog's tense posture suggested she had no intention of staying put. Slowly, Lila opened the door, the cold night air rushing in and prickling her skin. Her flashlight beam swept across the snow-covered ground, and that's when she saw it. Footprints. Human footprints leading away from the shelter and into the forest. Near the edge of the steps, a dark stain marked the pristine snow. Lila crouched to inspect it, her stomach turning when she realized it was blood. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Lila followed the trail of footprints, with Sandy close at her side. The golden retriever moved with surprising purpose, her nose low to the ground, as if she recognized the scent. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the thicker the trees became, their snow-laden branches blocking out the moonlight. The trail was erratic, the footprints weaving and staggering as if the person had been injured. The occasional droplets of blood added to the grim scene. Lila's mind raced with possibilities. Was this related to Sandy and the puppies, or was it something else entirely? After what felt like an eternity, the trail ended in a small clearing. Lila's flashlight illuminated the scene, and her breath caught in her throat. A tattered canvas bag lay discarded in the snow, its fabric stained and torn. Sandy approached cautiously, sniffing the bag before looking back at Lila with a whine. Kneeling in the snow, Lila unzipped the bag and peered inside. Papers were stuffed haphazardly within, many of them crumpled and damp. She pulled out a handful, scanning the contents under the flashlight. Her blood ran cold as she read the words scrawled across one of the documents, "The Golden Chain." The name struck a chord of recognition. She had come across whispers of it during her years as a detective, a shadowy organization tied to illegal animal trafficking. The Golden Chain was notorious for smuggling exotic animals, often stolen from the wild or bred in horrific conditions. Lila's hands trembled as she sifted through more of the papers. There were lists of species, shipment records, and even photographs of animals crammed into cages. Among them was a note written in hurried, uneven handwriting. "Lost shipment, priority retrieval." Her stomach churned as realization dawned. Sandy and her puppies weren't abandoned by accident. They were part of a shipment, merchandise in the eyes of the Golden Chain. And now someone was looking for them. Lila's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp bark from Sandy. The dog's body tensed, her eyes fixed on the shadowy edge of the clearing. Lila spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but she saw nothing. The forest was eerily silent, save for the crunch of snow under her boots as she stood. "We need to get back," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. Gathering the papers and stuffing them back into the bag, she slung it over her shoulder and motioned for Sandy to follow. The dog stayed close, her body low and alert, as they retraced their steps through the forest. Back at the shelter, Lila bolted the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Sandy immediately went to check on her puppies, nuzzling them gently before settling beside them. Lila placed the bag on the table and began sorting through its contents again, her mind racing. The evidence she had found confirmed her worst fears. Sandy and her pups weren't just survivors of cruelty, they were witnesses to something much larger. If the golden chain was actively searching for them, then Lila's discovery had just placed them all in grave danger. As the fire crackled softly, Lila glanced at Sandy. The dog's amber eyes met hers, filled with both trust and an unspoken question. "I'll protect you," Lila murmured, more to herself than the dog. But even as she said it, a chill ran down her spine. She knew the golden chain wouldn't stop, and now the clock was ticking. The early morning sun barely peeked through the dense clouds as Lila returned to the shelter, her breath fogging in the icy air. She had spent the night poring over the documents she'd found, piecing together the horrific scope of the golden chain's operations. Exhaustion weighed on her, but the gravity of the situation kept her focused. Sandy and her puppies were no longer just victims. They were key to exposing something much larger. But as Lila approached the shelter, something felt off. The door, usually firmly latched, was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. A cold dread crept over her. Dropping the bag of supplies she carried, Lila sprinted toward the entrance. "No, no, no," she muttered under her breath as she pushed the door open. Inside, the scene confirmed her worst fears. The room was in disarray. Blankets were strewn across the floor, the table overturned, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. "Sandy!" Lila called out, her voice trembling. The golden retriever appeared from the back of the shelter, her golden coat bristling and her amber eyes wide with panic. Sandy barked frantically, rushing from room to room as if searching for something. Lila's heart sank as she realized what was missing: the puppies. In the center of the room, a piece of paper fluttered under the breeze coming through the open door. Lila snatched it up, her hands shaking as she read the words scrawled in bold, jagged letters. "Stay out of this, or they'll disappear forever." Lila's stomach churned. The golden chain had found them. Her mind raced through the possibilities. How had they tracked Sandy and her pups? The documents she'd found? Her visit to the clearing? Or had they been watching all along? Sandy let out a mournful howl, running to the door and back, her body quivering with desperation. She barked again, staring at Lila as if begging her to fix this. Lila dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around the trembling dog. "We'll get them back," she whispered, though her own voice wavered with uncertainty. "I promise. We'll get them back." Lila's detective instincts kicked in as she surveyed the scene. The lock on the door had been expertly picked, not forced, a sign that this was no random break-in. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing and had left just enough evidence to deliver their warning. She spotted faint footprints in the snow outside, leading away from the shelter. They were human, large, deliberate, and spaced far enough apart to indicate the intruder had been in a hurry. The prints veered into the forest, heading in the direction of the clearing she and Sandy had discovered the night before. Lila grabbed her coat and flashlight, her mind racing with both fear and determination. "Sandy, let's go," she said, her voice firm. The dog didn't need coaxing. She bolted to the door, her nose to the ground as she picked up the trail. The forest seemed darker than usual, the towering trees casting long, eerie shadows over the snow. Lila moved quickly but cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the footprints ahead. Sandy led the way, her ears pricked and her body low to the ground. Every few steps she would pause, sniff the air, and glance back at Lila as if to ensure she was still following. The trail led them deeper into the woods until they reached a small, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. The structure was old, its wooden planks weathered and covered in moss, but a faint glow seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Lila crouched behind a tree, pulling Sandy close. Her heart pounded as she considered her next move. Peering through a gap in the boards, Lila caught sight of a man inside, his face obscured by shadows. He was pacing back and forth, a phone pressed to his ear. On a table beside him sat a metal cage covered with a thick tarp. Lila's chest tightened. She couldn't see the puppies, but she knew they had to be there. As she strained to hear the man's conversation, fragments of his words reached her. "Priority shipment. Don't care if it's risky. They're worth too much to lose." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The Golden Chain hadn't just stolen the puppies, they planned to sell them as part of their illegal trade. But the warning note made it clear. They weren't just after the puppies. They were after Sandy too. Lila's grip tightened on Sandy's collar as she leaned closer to the dog. "We're going to get them back," she whispered. But this wasn't going to be easy. The man wasn't working alone, and the risk of confrontation was high. She needed a plan, and fast. As Lila retreated into the shadows to form her strategy, Sandy remained by her side, her amber eyes locked on the cabin. Her quiet growl rumbled low in her throat, a testament to her fierce determination. Inside the shelter of the forest, Lila made a silent vow. Whoever these people were, they had underestimated her, and they had underestimated Sandy. They had taken the puppies, but they hadn't broken the bond between this mother and her children. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The morning after discovering the abandoned cabin, Lila's mind was set. She couldn't rescue the puppies on her own, not without risking everything. She needed backup, and there was only one person she could trust: Ethan Clark. Picking up her phone, she explained everything: the break-in, the threatening note, and the chilling discovery of the cabin. Ethan listened in grim silence before agreeing to meet her. Ethan arrived at the shelter within the hour, his expression serious as he stepped out of his patrol car. "This is bigger than we thought," he said, scanning the documents Lila had found in the canvas bag. "The Golden Chain isn't just trafficking exotic animals, they're running an entire network. If the puppies are part of this, they won't stop until they get what they want." Lila nodded. "We need to act fast. I think the cabin is just the tip of the iceberg. There has to be a larger operation somewhere nearby." Ethan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "There's an old warehouse on the edge of town. It's been abandoned for years, but I've heard rumors about strange activity there. It's worth checking out." Lila, Ethan, and Sandy set out later that day, driving toward the outskirts of Riverbend. The road grew rougher as they approached the dilapidated warehouse, its weathered walls covered in graffiti. The air was eerily still, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their boots as they approached the building. "Stay close," Ethan whispered, his hand resting on the holster at his side. Sandy trotted ahead, her nose to the ground. The golden retriever's body was tense, her movements cautious but deliberate. It was as if she knew her puppies were near. Inside, the warehouse was dark and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. Stacked crates and broken machinery littered the space, but what caught Lila's attention were the cages. Rows of metal cages lined the walls, each one holding an animal. Exotic birds with clipped wings, primates with haunted eyes, and malnourished wildcats stared back at her, their silent suffering filling the room with an oppressive weight. Ethan grimaced. "This is worse than I imagined," he muttered, his voice laced with anger. Lila's flashlight swept across the room until it landed on a smaller covered cage in the far corner. Sandy froze, her ears perking up and her tail stiffening. With a sharp bark, she bolted toward the cage, her nails clicking against the concrete floor. Lila followed, heart racing. She pulled back the tarp to reveal 5 trembling puppies huddled together. "We found them," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. She turned to Ethan. "We need to get them out of here, now!" Before they could act, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Lila and Ethan froze, instinctively stepping into the shadows. Sandy pressed herself low to the ground, her amber eyes fixed on the source of the noise. A group of men entered the room, their heavy boots thudding against the concrete. At the front of the group was a man Lila instantly recognized, Dr. Henry Morgan, the town's respected veterinarian. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The kind, soft-spoken man who had cared for countless pets in Riverbend was now standing at the center of an illegal trafficking operation. The juxtaposition was jarring, and the betrayal hit her like a punch to the gut. "Keep the shipment secure," Henry barked, his tone cold and commanding. "We'll move it tonight. We can't risk another delay." One of the men hesitated. "What about the dog and her pups? We can't leave loose ends." Henry's expression darkened. "Find them. We can't afford any liabilities." Lila exchanged a glance with Ethan, her pulse pounding in her ears. They needed to act, but the odds weren't in their favor. The warehouse was too open, and they were outnumbered. As Henry turned to leave, Sandy let out a low growl, her eyes blazing with defiance. Before Lila could stop her, the golden retriever lunged forward, her bark echoing through the warehouse. The men turned in unison, their flashlights sweeping across the room. "There!" one of them shouted, pointing at Sandy. Chaos erupted. Ethan drew his weapon, shouting, "Freeze! Police!" The men scattered, some reaching for weapons of their own. Lila darted toward the cage, fumbling with the lock as the puppies whimpered inside. Sandy stayed by her side, barking and snapping at anyone who dared come near. The sight of her, battered but unyielding, was enough to give Lila the courage she needed. Come on," she muttered, finally wrenching the cage door open. She scooped up the puppies, cradling them against her chest as Sandy stood guard. Henry's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop them!" he roared, his usual composure replaced by fury. He stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Lila. For a moment she saw the man she thought she had known, caring, compassionate. But that image quickly shattered. "You won't get away with this, Henry," Lila said, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her. Henry sneered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Lila. This isn't just about money. It's about power, and you're out of your depth." Ethan stepped between them, his weapon trained on Henry. "Not another step," he warned. "This ends now." Henry hesitated, his eyes flicking to the exit. Before he could make a move, backup arrived, sirens blaring as police cars pulled up outside. The remaining men surrendered, and Henry was handcuffed, his face a mask of cold fury. As the police secured the scene, Lila knelt beside Sandy, who was licking her puppies and nudging them with her nose. Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she whispered, "We did it, girl. They're safe now." But even as relief washed over her, a lingering unease remained. The golden chain was bigger than Henry Morgan, and this victory felt like only the beginning of a much larger battle. For now, though, Sandy and her pups were safe, and that was enough. The morning after the raid on the warehouse, the headlines lit up with the story of the golden chain's downfall. "Animal trafficking ring exposed in Riverbend" was plastered across local newspapers and online news outlets, accompanied by photos of the rescued animals and a subdued Henry Morgan being led away in handcuffs. For Lila, it was a bittersweet victory. The warehouse raid had saved countless lives, but it was only a small dent in a much larger operation. Still, the story of the brave golden retriever who had risked everything for her puppies captured the public's heart. People began referring to her as Sandy, a name the shelter volunteers had affectionately chosen for her. Sandy and her 5 puppies had recovered well under Lila's care. The puppies, once frail and trembling, now scampered around the shelter, their playful barks filling the air. Sandy watched over them with unwavering vigilance, her amber eyes soft with relief and love. Lila decided to officially adopt Sandy and her pups, giving them the stable, loving home they deserved. The decision wasn't easy. Her life as a former detective-turned-shelter operator was busy and unpredictable, but Sandy had become more than a rescue. She was family. As Lila signed the adoption papers, she couldn't help but smile. "You've come a long way, girl," she whispered, stroking Sandy's golden coat. "And so have I." The publicity from the case brought attention not only to Sandy's story, but also to the grim reality of animal trafficking. Donations began pouring into Lila's shelter, along with messages of support from people inspired by Sandy's courage. Using this momentum, Lila launched a campaign called Shadows No More to combat animal trafficking and raise awareness about the plight of animals like Sandy. The campaign included educational programs, collaborations with law enforcement, and outreach to communities to report suspicious activities. Ethan, now a regular fixture at the shelter, helped connect Lila with state and federal agencies to strengthen their efforts. "This isn't just about one case," he told her one evening over coffee. "It's about making sure this never happens again." Lila nodded, her resolve firm. "Sandy gave me the strength to start this. We owe it to her, and every animal like her, to make a difference." Sandy's story spread far beyond Riverbend. Photos of her, sitting proudly with her pups, became a symbol of resilience and hope. She was invited to community events, schools, and even a local news segment where she sat beside Lila, calm and composed, as they shared their journey. Children flocked to pet her, their small hands gently stroking her fur as Lila recounted the story of Sandy's bravery. "She fought for her babies, even when the odds were against her," Lila told them. "She's a reminder that even in the darkest times, we can find strength." Sandy's presence had an undeniable impact, inspiring others to adopt, volunteer, or report cases of abuse and neglect. The once lost dog had become a hero, her story changing lives in ways Lila hadn't thought possible. Despite the triumphs, a question lingered in Lila's mind. How many more animals like Sandy were still out there, suffering in silence? Every time she looked into Sandy's amber eyes, she was reminded of the scars the dog carried, not just the ones on her body, but the invisible ones left by cruelty and neglect. One evening, as Sandy lay curled at her feet and the puppies played nearby, Lila voiced her thoughts aloud. "How many more, Sandy? How many others need saving?" The dog's ears twitched, and she let out a soft huff, as if sharing Lila's determination. As the weeks passed, Lila found herself busier than ever, balancing the demands of the shelter with the growing responsibilities of her campaign. But no matter how hectic things became, she always made time for Sandy and her pups. One snowy afternoon, as the puppies chased each other around the yard, Sandy sat beside Lila, her head resting on her lap. Lila smiled, her hand running through the dog's soft fur. "We're going to keep fighting," she said quietly. "For all of them." The golden retriever lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting Lila's. In that moment, Lila saw not just the dog she had rescued, but a survivor, a symbol, and a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was always light to be found. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered yard, Lila knew their journey was far from over. Together they would continue to shine that light, one life at a time,